Everyone. Thank you, Nikki. Today I would like to welcome Dr. Eric Stokan. He is the director for the Center for Social Science Scholarship. He's an associate professor of political science and an affiliate faculty in the School of Public Policy here at UMBC. He is going to present about transdisciplinary collaborations to address our wicked problems. Dr. Stokan, you're welcome. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for the introduction. So I'll go ahead and share my slides and try to put it into, okay. Just gonna see if I could see my notes, but sorry, let me see if there's a better way to share this so that you're not seeing the notes along with me. Well, that's okay. So I'm not able to see any of you, but if you have any questions, certainly feel free to stop me during the presentation or make any comments. So very glad to be here. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Eric Stokan. As Josephine noted, am in the Department of Political Science and also affiliate in the Policy School. And I'm going to draw on some of my training and experience in those fields. The title of my talk, Transdisciplinary Collaborations to Address Our Wicked Problems, is, I guess I'll go through the process of kind of unpacking some of these terms so we're all on the same page. But this is a little bit different of a presentation than I typically give. It's not kind of a core research product that I've been working on. Rather, it's going to reflect some of my own experiences in research and really help to hopefully motivate all of us to think more broadly about how we engage in our collaborative efforts, and particularly within the academic community. So, I'll start by describing what I mean by transdisciplinary collaborations. Many of us, I think, are familiar with this notion of interdisciplinary collaborations or interdisciplinarity. Even my own field of public policy and public administration itself is sort of naturally interdisciplinary. My formal training in a PhD program in policy included about a third of my courses in economics, a third in political science, and then a third in public administration theory and policy sciences. There is sort of a fundamental difference that exists between how we think about interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinary collaborations. A fundamental difference exists here because transdisciplinary also includes sort of a greater sort of appreciation and development for a shared language around those collaborative efforts. It also means extending beyond the sort of formal academic community and working more collaboratively with partners that might exist in government, in nonprofits, and think tanks, or other practitioners who are essentially focused on the same issues or concerns. So hopefully that gives you a sense of kind of what I mean broadly by transdisciplinary collaborations. Of course, the other term that you're going to see here that's fundamental to understanding this talk is this notion of wicked problems. And in the 1970s, early 1970s, there was this article that was put out by Riddle and Weber called Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning. And this article really was sort of a reflection of the fact that some problems are inherently different than other problems. And if you read the article, they will make reference to some of the problems that we might experience in the natural sciences. We could think about problems around optimization, where there's a particular solution which is going to be most efficient or most optimal. They spend a fair amount of text focused on even sort of chess problems. Get to checkmate in 5 moves, right? There is a particular solution that will exist, and of course we can think about maybe the most efficient process for doing that. Or my son loves to play with Rubik's cubes. He loves to solve Rubik's cubes, and of course there may be a most efficient algorithm for being able to solve the cube given a certain position, right? But we can recognize that unlike that sort of problem, many of our societal problems are somewhat challenged because they don't have a single solution. And what Riddle and Weber do in this article is they basically sort of differentiate what they're going to call wicked problems from these other types of problems that are more tractable and that can have a solution. So I'm not going to unpack all of the kind of core factors that sort of differentiate wicked problems from more traditional problems. But even just looking at this first term here is important. They recognize that there's no definite formulation of these problems. We may not even fundamentally agree on how we define the problem itself. So I'll just give an example. If we were thinking about the usage of, say, a large language model for a classroom paper, I might see it as an issue. I might point to the fact that maybe there's no standard policy that we have university-wide that's going to indicate what's acceptable or permissible. Someone else might point to a wholly different set of factors that give rise to this problem, or just view it very differently. They might think about it in terms of the user. Others might, blame Sam Altman and think it's, a fundamental issue of, technocrats who've released these tools. And yet others would say it's no problem at all. In fact, if there's a problem, it's that we are not doing enough to prepare students to use these kinds of tools in the classroom. So, societal issues like this become very tricky because in the absence of sort of starting from the same position and thinking about the problem in the same way, it becomes a lot more challenging then to gain any traction and be able to solve any kind of problem. So again, I'm not going to unpack all of these, but I just want to give you a flavor for what I mean by wicked problems. I will focus on a couple things. And then I'll move from sort of this abstract notion of a wicked problem and actually talk about specific problems that, are kind of characterized as wicked problems. So every wicked problem may itself be a symptom of another problem. So each of these problems become tightly interconnected, right? So, and I'll just kind of throw out an example at this point. If we take, for example, income inequality as a problem, well, that itself may be a function of where one lives, for example. There might not be access to employment centers. Okay, well, then maybe the problem is that there's no reliable transportation to get to those employment centers. And you start to see how just interconnected these problems become. And in this way, they become sort of self-reinforcing. In economic development and urban policy, we often talk about vicious and virtuous cycles, right? The fact that one problem may lead to another problem, which leads to another problem, and it starts to compound, right? A vicious cycle. So, that is sort of the nature of these wicked problems. And there's often multiple explanations. Well, really, they would argue that there's always multiple explanations for any given wicked problem. As a result, and if we think about what this means, you know, there's no sort of single silver bullet that we can use to solve that problem. If we stick with income inequality, yeah, employment, may be one dimension of that. It could also be, as noted, the lack of transportation access. It could be, food insecurity that gives rise to making it more challenging to even sustain employment, and so on and so forth. Each of those then become, in policy terms, causal roots. And if we want to address these large scale, wicked problems, then we need solutions that can actually address each core underlying problem. So you start to get, a sense of just how complex these things are. Solutions that are not sort of true or false, but good or bad. Their ability to move the needle is what becomes important. I think we would have a hard time ever saying, poverty or income inequality is gone. Like, what exactly would that mean? And we could kind of go back to that first point of like, we might define it differently, right? And there's sort of no stopping rule, right? Such that when we think about what a solution might be in say a chess game, right? There might be a definitive set of steps that we can take that leads to the culmination of, the sort of optimization problem, and we can thereby, solve it or find that solution. With these kinds of problems, given the nature of them, there really is no stopping rule. Again, it's going to be, we'd be hard pressed to find agreement on precisely what it would mean to say we've completely eradicated, income inequality. So, again, there's going to be no particular solution. And so a lot of the examples that we deal with in the policy realm, and I think that, this group in particular would certainly recognize in terms of major challenges that we might try to address, such as climate change or affordable housing or urban sprawl, are emblematic of these kinds of problems. And so, I think the core focus then is trying to understand how we can gain leverage on these sorts of problems. And again, it's never with that idea that we're going to find this magic bullet or kind of optimal solution to it, but how we can come to approach these problems in ways that, we bring our own sort of disciplinary focus together in these sort of broader collaborations. The one other thing I'll say about a lot of these wicked problems is that they also have this sort of path-dependent nature to them, meaning that they exhibit this kind of what I would call lock-in behavior, right? If we take climate change as an example here, and we use a more specific, concrete example of, say, let's say a hurricane that impacts our community, right? Well, after the hurricane makes landfall and there's major destruction and it impacts our systems and our infrastructure, a very common response to that, of course, is to sort of rebuild. Well, in that process, right, we can think about what exactly that means in terms of the kinds of resources that we have to bring to bear, the prospect that we are in some way through the actual process of rebuilding, kind of contributing to some of the kind of core pollutants that might itself give rise to, further effects down the future. We think about this a lot in the policy sciences, where, when I look at communities and my background more specifically started by focusing on economic development decisions. So I would see these communities that would tend to use, major tax breaks to try to attract businesses to their community. And, one of the things that I would try to understand is, I guess I'll add this component to it. There was ample research at the time that demonstrated that the utilization of, these major tax breaks and tax abatements were just economically inefficient, right? And a lot of communities also recognize this fact. They realize that the actual tax dollars that they would use, the actual public subsidies that were being offered, were inefficient in addressing, whatever the core concern was. In this case, maybe trying to increase employment, right? And nonetheless, they would continue to use these kinds of policies. And as a result, they're engaged in sort of a path-dependent process, right? We've used tax abatements in the past. It's a tool that we know how to use. We continue to use it to try to attract businesses. And as a result, we then continue to use it going forward, right? And so there's this kind of lock-in effect that takes place. It's much more challenging to then deviate from that path. And I think as academics, we sometimes engage in the same process, right? We may have been trained from our own disciplinary perspectives. And thus, when we think about attacking any sort of research question, we bring the same sort of intellectual history, we bring all the socialization elements from our training, the same methods, and as a result, we might not be thinking about other ways to address, say, that research question. Sorry, is there a question? Again, sorry, I can't see anyone, and I also can't see any of my notes, so just bear with me. But if you have a question, feel free to interrupt. So, colleagues and I have done some research looking at these path-dependent processes in the context of economic development and trying to understand, for example, how local governments can overcome this path dependency. And, I'll start out by saying it's not easy to overcome. In fact, when we look at the propensity to use tax abatements, 20 years later, so we have a set of local governments, we know whether they used tax abatements in the 1980s. We look at, were they using them in the early 2000s and mid 2000s, or like 2010, were they still using those same sets of policies, or were they trying different strategies? We could see that the fact that they used those policies earlier on and at that earlier time point had a major impact on their continued usage today. Even when you accounted for, other factors that we know are related to the probability of using any kind of policy tool. And so, one thing that I think we always have to bear in mind with these kinds of problems and these kinds of processes is that there's sort of a reason why they were initially used, right? There are a set of factors that give rise to their initial utilization. And if something exists, and if these kind of processes become path dependent, that means those same factors are often reinforced over and over and over. And the longer that those processes endure, the more challenging it is to actually break that path, right? And so what I want to argue is that in those cases where we do see a divergence, where we do see the prospect of breaking that path, it has often meant that there were considerable resources and actors in the sort of policy or social context that helped to break that process. So excellent, right? We know that it just then requires collaboration and resources. And by engaging in those kinds of collaborations, we can bring to bear more resources. So that's it. Okay, I'm done. No, I'm just kidding. Collaboration is important, right? We probably all, like, on a surface level, understand that, but collaboration is also not easy, right? Again, I'll draw on the case of economic development, because local governments would be well served in many cases to actually collaborate around economic development, but they're often engaged in competition with one another. So this is John Oliver talking about the economic development war that exists between Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri, and how inefficient it is that governments within the same metropolitan region, so you can think of like the Baltimore metro region or the DC metropolitan region, are going to be competing for the same businesses. And they're going to use large scale economic development policies or a lot of public tax dollars to try to attract a business sometimes a few miles away from where they're currently located. So we can all recognize that that's, from a regional standpoint, certainly inefficient. But of course, competition is going to be a critical element here. And the notion then of trying to collaborate in the face of that competition is challenged. But even if there hadn't existed this sort of competitive pressure to, compete with one another around these economic development activities, or, access to these jobs, there would still exist a whole set of costs that are associated with trying to cooperate with one another. And so in economics and in public administration, we often think about what's called transaction cost theory. And this involves a whole set of costs. We could think about bargaining costs. For example, we would have to engage in some sort of negotiated process around, what we often consider sort of poaching. Like if I try to steal a firm from your local jurisdiction, and maybe you're trying to do the same, we might come to some agreement that it's in both of our best interest not to do that, right? So there's cost though in that negotiation process. What does that look like? Of course, there's going to be information costs. And in this environment, there are often what we'd call information asymmetries. One government may have more information than another government about those business interests. Certainly, the businesses themselves often have more information than the governments do. So the actual cost of trying to acquire that information also poses challenges to collaborations. There's agency costs, right? Someone has to actually monitor that agreement and enforce it. And there's divisional costs. So the more fragmented, and this could literally mean politically fragmented, our region, the more jurisdictions that we have that are competing around economic development, the more costly it is to try to broker any sort of collaborative process. And there is a framework that I want to call your attention to that's developed in the field of public administration, borrowing from Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom. We recognize that these sort of collaborative activities and sort of the decision to engage in any sort of collaborative activity requires thinking about all of these transaction costs and weighing them against sort of the expected benefits that one might receive. And, so Serena, Kim, and others have recently sort of built on this earlier ICA framework by recognizing that these kinds of decision-making processes, particularly when we're thinking about institutional collaborations, have, sort of a mechanism cost. And, we can think about what kind of mechanism would best keep in place any sort of collaboration that we might engage in. Maybe it is, in the case of governments, maybe it's some sort of contract, maybe it's a regional governing entity. There has to be something that's actually going to hold these kind of contracts in place or these agreements in place. But oftentimes these processes are dynamic, right? There's a feedback loop that exists such that, if we're looking at Washington, D.C., the governments here of D.C., of, Montgomery County, and let's say Crystal City, and they engage in some sort of agreement around economic development. Well, this is not a static sort of one-time agreement. Of course, they're going to look at what happens over some period. And, did these partners hold up on their agreement from the prior time point? So there's this feedback and sort of learning mechanism that takes place. And what I want to argue is that, I'm certainly using the context that I know well and thinking about kind of economic development as an example here. But of course, collaborations that occur between disciplinary boundaries have some of these same sorts of costs that are associated with them. I'll talk shortly about the various benefits that might be realized. And of course, I'm anchoring this whole talk in that, like, I think this is our best opportunity to address wicked problems. So I think we all need to be thoughtful in these kinds of collaborations. But, we can recognize, for example, that there are information costs. If you decide you're going to, collaborate with someone from, the policy sciences or economics or sociology, you recognize that inherent in that choice is this understanding that you're going to at least have to understand how they talk about the same, maybe the same phenomena that you're dealing with, but where you have different terminology, right? If I think about, data science, and I've had some training in data science as well as, statistics, and there's this famous article by Bremen talking about the two cultures, sort of the algorithmic culture and the probability theory-based statistics culture, that, at times there's not even always a shared language, right? We might call on the statistics side something an independent variable, and then, on the data science side, call it a factor, or we can think about dependent variables and the target and so on and so forth. So there's sort of information cost embedded in even tackling the same problem because we may be thinking about it from slightly different perspectives, right? So these kinds of costs, and that's just sort of a small example, we could absolutely disagree in terms of the kind of bargaining cost process about if we engage in this collaboration, where should we publish this article, right? Maybe, for your tenure case, you're only going to consider, the audiences that are in line with your disciplinary background, or it may be discounted, right? And so there's all these costs that are sort of embedded in engaging in just interdisciplinary collaborations. When we extend this to think about transdisciplinary, and we think about, research efforts, for example, with community partners, the incentive structures vastly differ, right? I've collaborated on scholarly projects with practitioners, and their sort of timeline and focus is going to be very different. The sort of day-to-day activities that they might need to engage in might mean that they're on a different timeline than I am. So, we recognize that all these sort of costs exist for any kind of interdisciplinary collaboration. And I'm happy to provide these slides if anyone's interested. There's a recent article actually drawing on kind of transdisciplinary approaches between history and computer science and linguistics, kind of all the different groups that are represented in this web diagram. And what these authors are showing is that there are differences, of course, even by a disciplinary tradition in terms of whether academics in those fields will be more inclined toward single-authored publications or multi-authored, whether they'd prefer journal articles or monographs, right? And again, inherent in all this is a set of different incentive structures. And how we overcome that, I think, is something that actually can be promoted at an institutional level, right? And I think to some extent we do see that, right? Grants or resources that are available to interdisciplinary teams, for example, are there in part to help overcome what would otherwise serve as these barriers. Um, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. There is recent research that's kind of focused on how we should be thinking about these kinds of collaborations. If we can get to this point of, what we'd either call, well, these are different concepts, but interactional expertise and contributory expertise, it is sort of this greater integration in collaborative efforts around even our linguistics. Like, my desire, for example, to understand how economists describe a phenomena, or a data science scholar actually acquiring the linguistic capacity to engage, to understand at a deeper level the meaning behind those concepts, can become a bridge to or remove any sort of barrier to engaging in that collaboration. And then developing that expertise to actually contribute to it in a meaningful way is sort of the ideal, right? And I think I want to make an argument here that these kinds of collaborations that happen across disciplinary perspectives are really important. I'm drawing on the example of behavioral economics, but we could think about the CRISPR technologies. We could think about, I guess, all these people are winning Nobel Prizes. So not every collaboration leads to a Nobel Prize, right? But this sort of disciplinary connection between psychology and economics has been hugely important for not only our sort of intellectual understanding of human behavior, but also for being able to utilize those advances to actually improve societal benefits, right? Again, kind of getting at that wicked problem. So, if we think about behavioral economics and the recognition that individuals are not completely rational, in fact, we know that they're often systematically irrational in ways that are very predictable. We can use that information to help improve the lives of individuals. And, one illustrative example have been realized through experiments with retirement accounts and what in behavioral economics we often call choice architecture, right? This idea that from a purely rational economic standpoint, it should not matter if we decide to make one of our programs an opt-in or an opt-out process. If I'm looking at the same form and I'm deciding whether I want to contribute to my retirement, and I can, select 5% or nothing, let's just say, keep it simple. And the form is pre-filled to nothing, or that's scenario A. Scenario B is that it's pre-filled to 5%. And I'm there and I get to pick which one. I just uncheck a box. It's the same process either way. But what behavioral economics shows us is that if it's pre-filled to contribute 5%, statistically, it's a lot more likely that I'll keep it checked at 5%. And in the long run, that will have serious implications for my retirement account prior to this week. Just kidding. So, realistically, it really does, these kinds of collaborative efforts and these engagements across disciplinary boundaries really do matter, right? And they can matter in important ways societally as well. Just wanted to call your attention to, what I would consider some interesting transdisciplinary collaborations that are happening now. There's the Library Innovation Lab at Harvard Law School that has recently been focused on sort of backing up federal data and creating data tools that help to acquire information and data that might be lost across our federal agencies. And what's really fascinating about this is just looking at this sort of collaborative effort and who's involved in this kind of engagement. You have software engineers, you have librarians, lawyers, journalists, and others across sectors that are all engaged in this. And they are part of this, what I would call transdisciplinary team. And if you think about the nature of this, right, and sort of, trying to back up, for example, federal data that might otherwise go missing, no individual disciplinary perspective can do this on its own, right? You could be a software engineer, but you might not understand, for example, what the laws are that govern, how you can access that data, how you can accumulate it, can you reproduce it and put it onto a website? In the absence of someone maybe coming from the political or policy side, you might, in some cases, not fully understand sort of the political ramifications or kind of the impact that some of these resources might have on our social policies that exist, right? So you can see how these kinds of efforts can really be important in addressing some of our most pressing societal issues today. I'll happily again provide these slides. this just kind of gives you a sense of this sort of contributory expertise that these different disciplinary perspectives bring, as well as the interactional expertise, right? But really, it takes these different actors coming together and coming to an understanding of how best to approach this process. Of course, the other silver lining to thinking about collaborations are that there's often, increasingly resources that exist specifically in some cases to, engage in interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research. So, there are incentives that are in place to engage these processes. We see examples here from campus, happily, throwing out a plug for iHARP, CS3, the Imaging Research Center that has engaged on some broader, efforts across disciplinary boundaries to, tackle some of the problems and challenges that we face today. And I'm very fortunate to get to work with data science scholars, including Dilnez, who has joined on a project focused on how local governments are preparing for flooding. This is a part of the Metropolitan Governance and Management Transitions Lab that I co-direct with Aaron Delott, where we're trying to work on projects that explicitly involve individuals from across disciplinary boundaries. As an example, on the particular project that Dilnez is involved in, we have someone who's a former FEMA official who is a co-author on the project and is helping give us insights into what these actual collaborations look like when communities become vulnerable to flooding. Who does the local government partner with? What kind of organizational collaborations do we see in that space, and to make sure that we're capturing that in our research, right? And so that's just one example. Finally, I'll just kind of give a plug for any of those that are interested in forging collaborations. I can't spend 40 some minutes talking about the theory of collaboration and not offer an opportunity to engage in those collaborative processes. So, feel free to reach out to myself and to the Center for Social Science Scholarship. I hope you'll consider collaborating with us going forward. So let me stop there. I want to make sure, we have time for questions, and then I'll also be able to see you guys now. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stokan. Yeah.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
It's good to see so many people on here. So I'm sure we have some interesting questions, and we're looking forward to hearing what they have to share. So the floor is open for questions, please.
Just not all at once, It's a lot to digest. It's a lot to take in,
So maybe I'll get us started. I know
Yeah.
you talked about bringing different actors together in solving some of these wicked problems. And there is a lot of inertia in each of our disciplines, right?
Mm-hmm.
To break through. There's obviously trust building. So could you share from your experience, how do you try to bring disciplines out of inertia? I know you alluded to some of the elements across your presentation, but if you could give some examples from your experience, that would be great.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, right? And I'm not sure I'm gonna have here's the solution, right? But what I will say is, I think it absolutely has to start with, conversations, communication, and sort of an understanding and a respect for individuals of, whether it's a different discipline or whether, for example, it's a collaboration with non-academics, right? And I think what's important is to also really try to be empathetic and understand kind of what their interests are in that engagement. You know, so for example, like I collaborated on a book chapter with just really wonderful person, Erica Raleigh, who's the executive director of Data Driven Detroit. This is it's a local nonprofit that is principally focused on kind of gathering data to help inform policy decisions. And you know, sort of the kind of respective interests in working on a chapter or some sort of academic article, it had to be with an understanding of like, how would this actually be beneficial for your organization or for you personally as well, right? And then thinking about what kind of dimensions and sort of resources can we both bring to bear on this kind of engagement, you know. But I think a lot of it, if it's done authentically and it's done in a way where, you know, you're trying to understand the respective interests of a potential partner, then I think that goes a long way towards, you know, at least starting that engagement. And then, you know, I think trust then is built over time, right? It's you know, not a one-off. You don't you know, automatically create trust and then it's unbreakable, right? It's continuing to kind of act in good faith, and you know, and I think you know, that sort of dynamic then can lead to more fruitful engagements long term.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I have a question. So you spoke about the barriers to transdisciplinary collaboration, and you mentioned things about competition theory as well as, you know, other transaction cost theories. So in your example, you cited economic development, in particular looking at local governments and how they may have competing interests. Do you envision a role of academia in trying to bridge these potential barriers that may exist, you know, and citing to what you've responded to about trust building, how the role of academia and researchers can maybe take on the responsibility to minimize or downplay these types of issues or barriers? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a excellent question. I wish I could say for sure as an academic, I'll easily be able to convince them that they should engage in more collaborations and less competition. But of course, you know, we have to understand the politics here as well, right? These are you know, local governments and the politicians that run local governments, of course, are political actors. And one thing we know for certain is that our political interests don't always align squarely with our economic interests, right? So often there's strong political reason that they may engage in that sort of competition. And in fact, a collaborator and colleague of mine, Nate Jensen, has written a fairly recent book called Incentives to Pander, where he shows experimentally that you know, even though politicians might recognize that economically it's less beneficial and that it may be more costly than it is beneficial, that they'll still engage in this kind of behavior. And in fact, citizens may punish them if they don't compete. So there's strong reasons to. But you know, to your question, I mean, I do think academic institutions play a role. I'll make a plug for, I know Dr. Aaron DeLotte is going to be speaking to this group soon. He's going to talk about elements around like knowledge infrastructure and universities. And I think this is one realm where we can help to play a role, which is that, you know, when we think about these collaborations, one of those costs, of course, is information costs. And I think as academics, we are well positioned to help mitigate that overall cost. You know, we can help to try to understand the respective interests of parties and to show them why different types of collaborations may actually be beneficial by minimizing that information.
Thank you.
But and just a little plug for his talk. So.
Thank you. Alexander, any question?
Yes, I was recently looking into the general influence of neoliberal value systems and institutions. I guess I was kind of thinking about it from the standpoint of path dependency, how a lot of that such factors influence the different parties in the transdisciplinary environment. So I guess one of my questions is, would you say that interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity might be more favorable to being able to liberate the process from such influences? What do you think about it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question and not an easy one. So thank you for that. I think there's a little bit to unpack there, right? When we think about sort of neoliberal positions, that sometimes kind of inherent in them is this notion of greater independence and independent actors, that it might suggest that there's, in some cases, less kind of willingness or desire to engage in kind of transdisciplinary approaches or perspectives. I don't think, interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approaches are going to kind of overcome any entrenched value system that might, seek to sort of minimize those efforts. But, I think there are certainly a lot of actors that stand to benefit from those engagements. So I'm not sure I've completely answered your question, but
it's fair. I was because what you were talking about prompted me to think about it, but I think it's a fair answer. It's not, as you said, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Bruce? Bruce, you have a question?
I'm sorry. There we go. How's that?
Yes,
Great.
Yeah, very nice presentation. I graduated with a PhD from UMBC in 2003. So for all the students on, it's been really beneficial to me in a career. I'm starting to retire. I worked on a regulation in the state of Maryland for heat stress. We got it through the state government. It is a regulation. OSHA is trying to do the same thing. They have 58,000 comments, and administration that absolutely will not let it fly. So can you speak to the importance of local governments as far as innovations and getting things done? Because that's our only hope right now with this particular horrible administration, in my opinion.
Yeah. Thank you for your question, and thank you for engaging in that form of public service. I increasingly feel like we are dependent on local governments and to some extent our state governments at this stage for addressing a lot of the sort of what I would call the wicked problems, right? Those sets of challenges that we have, whether we're talking climate change or housing unaffordability. And I think to your point, local, the one thing we often say in the policy sciences and policy studies is that, to some extent, local governments we can think of as kind of the laboratories of democracy, right? This goes back to Justice Brandeis, that this notion that we have a lot of different local governments, there's a lot of variation, they become kind of labs for innovation in terms of our policy solutions. And the great part about that is that if we engage in some large scale federal program that is unsuccessful, that doesn't work, the cost implications are much greater than if we do this at the local or state level. And then we learn from it, right? And we tweak it and we build on that. And, this is, I would certainly say this is not the first time that local governments, I feel, have had to kind of go it alone. It's, and I guess I will just say it is sort of, okay, it's actually very unfortunate. I think that they're in many cases not getting sort of more support for tackling some of the issues that we see, because, while they may be great at innovating, a lot of the wicked problems that we see don't know jurisdictional boundaries, right? If you're talking about, heat, or if we're talking about flooding, or we're talking about, a whole host of other issues, there are positive spillover effects that happen, right? And so we know that, what one local government does may have implications for others, right? So this is where you hope that you have higher levels of government that are positioned to address those concerns when they do span multiple boundaries. But, again, I want to leave you with a more hopeful note that I do think local governments are aware of this, and they are increasingly engaged in, collaborative networks and recognize some of these underlying issues. And, I have great hope in our public servants and our local governments for, addressing these problems. So yeah, thank you for your question.
Sure, I do too. Thank you.
Yeah.
Room for one more question, if anyone.
So maybe if there's no other question, can I ask one more?
No problem here.
Okay, great. So I wanted to ask about students as bridge or building these transdisciplinary collaborations. I know you've worked with the data science scholars, and several of our students actually work with people from different domains and disciplines. It's a hard problem for the students as well, because then they have to kind of be the bridge, but it's also rewarding at the end of it. So I guess my question is, how do we show the value to students? And how do we optimize this in a way that it's beneficial for everyone?
Yeah.
And do you think there's value in having students as a bridge to transdisciplinarity?
Yeah, I'll take the last part of that first, which is 100%. I actually think students in a lot of ways are the perfect bridge, right? Because they are not as entrenched in our own disciplinary positions. They haven't sort of been fully socialized to the same extent that we might have in our own disciplinary positions. But how we demonstrate to them that these kind of efforts are worthwhile, I think it's a harder but more important question, right? And I think here too, we need to think about, just like I'd say in any other sort of collaborative effort, we need to think about their incentive structures and what they would gain from this process. I think partly it's trying to indicate, if we're talking about, join my project, focus on, how local governments are preparing for flooding, demonstrating that, this is societally important, that we need data science students to help us, grapple with these kinds of challenges, is one step in that path. But then also, one of the things I do in any engagement with research assistants is really try to understand what their long-term hopes and goals are, and then figure out how that aligns with the project, and be very intentional and thoughtful about ensuring that whatever they do in the context of that project, that they're getting some sort of skill or some sort of benefit or exposed to some sort of network that I think will ultimately serve them in the long term. So it's kind of trying to make sure I well understand, their incentives, what they hope to gain out of it. And I think in this way, between the sort of nature of these transdisciplinary projects and also, a thoughtful evaluation of how they stand to benefit, I hope that would go a long way towards convincing them that these are worthwhile endeavors.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the thoughtful questions. As someone who I know is a major proponent of, transdisciplinary actions and activities, and has brought, to bear great resources in those efforts, I, certainly thank you as well.
Of course, thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stokan, and thank you everyone for joining today. He did share his QR code. I hope you had a moment to scan it, but we also have his information available on the iHARP website, and there'll be a follow-up email. He's placed his email in the chat, and there will be a follow-up email. Dr. Stokan, if you can share your slides, that will also be greatly appreciated. We will upload the presentation as well on our iHARP page and on YouTube and LinkedIn and so on. So thank you so much again for your time. It's been wonderful listening to you.
Well, thank you for having me, and I've very much enjoyed being here, and I appreciate all of your questions. So feel free to reach out at any point, but thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Have a good one, everyone.
Yeah, take care.